Now, if you'll remember, the context of all of this is, the overarching context of all of this, of course, is holiness and the function of Christians within a government, the Christians within a kingdom, if you will. Romans 13 talks about the extension of that through government, and we saw last week that all governments are appointed by God, and their purpose is, number one, to represent God on earth, and number two, to execute justice, to execute his laws on earth. So governments have a specific purpose of God. And we talked about how vengeance is to be executed not by the individual, but it is to be placed in the hands of God. And he meets that out through his mediums, and one is the government. Well, if we're talking about government, then obviously one of the things that we have to talk about is, how does it exist in a practical sense? God's appointed government for our well-being, and government employees, unfortunately, have to be paid. Budgets have to be met, with my wife as a due exception, of course, because she's a wonderful government employee. I will not be sleeping tonight, at least not in our bed. So governments, obviously, as Scripture has told us, are there for us. They are there to protect us. They are there for our well-being. But in order for them to function, they need to receive some sort of income. And the primary method for governments to collect revenue obviously comes from taxation of its citizenry. And I will advise you right now that in talking about this particular subject, because it's so narrow, I'm using for the most part R.C.'s understanding of this text. It's a great, short little treatment. So nothing that I'm going to say for the most part is going to be original. So it is through taxation that governments pay, they meet budgets, etc. And we have to keep in mind that governments really, for all intents and purposes, they don't produce anything in the marketplace. Their sole function is for us. So in that sense, government employees are, in a very real manner, public servants. They're called to be public servants. In Scripture, we see, for the most part, that God commands that only two individuals truly are supposed to receive monetary support. One of the Levites and the other of the civil magistrates. And the Levites, if you will recall, obviously the priests, the ministers to the kingdom, the ministers before God's throne, they were also a teaching office. And they were, in their capacity, not only ministers, but they were also involved in public service. And God commanded that they be paid through the tithe. And by the same token, the civil magistrates were supposed to be paid through the various taxes. It's interesting right there, just to pause for 1 second and keep in mind what I just said. If all governments are established by God, then really what you're talking about when you talk about the citizenry paying a tithe, you're talking about a nation paying ministers. Now think about that in today's context. The first thing that you would hear is, well, that's a violation of separation of church and state, would you not? So just keep that in mind, that government has a transcendent definition, not a human definition in the context of what we're talking about. Government is defined by God. So, Levites were supposed to be paid through the tithe, and civil magistrates also received money through various taxes. However, there became an issue with Christians through the early stages of the development of the church. And this issue started with the monastic movement, because the monastic movement was an intention to deny themselves of earthly connections and to deny themselves of worldliness. And one of this, of course, would be monetary remuneration. Because of the influence of monasticism throughout history, this idea suddenly developed that pastors of local churches were basically to be poor. They were to receive a bare minimum wage. However, if you look at the Old Testament and you look at the Levites who were the beneficiaries of the tithes, they were to receive the first offerings, and for the most part, their level of remuneration made them affluent. I mean, they weren't wealthy by any stretch of the imagination, but they weren't poor either. They had their own property. Oh, didn't have the property, but they had a significant amount of wealth, which presents a stark contrast to what we see today. One of the most virulent criticisms of ministers today is the amount of money they make. Now, as I said, the Levites weren't rich. They weren't the top 1%, so to speak. But they also weren't poor and destitute. They had a very, very comfortable life. Which leads Paul to say in the next verse, render therefore to all their dues. And he's not speaking of the dues that you pay to be the part of a club. In other words, give everyone what is owed. And then he lists some of those things. You owe taxes, you pay taxes, revenue, respect, you give them respect, honor, then you give them honor. We'll get to that in just a second. Paul is making a transition here, and he's making a distinction between taxes and customary dues and duties, and duty in the economic sense, that are to be paid. We hear all about taxes today. I mean, we're in an election cycle, so that is going to be brutally beaten over our heads in the next 14 months or 12 months or so. And we hear it from both parties. But what Paul is talking about here, he's talking about two different types of taxes. He's talking about a head tax, and he's talking about property taxes. And the head tax was imposed by the Roman government, and the property tax was imposed upon landowners in Rome. In addition, there were certain other customs and duties and requirements placed on merchandise. We kind of call them a sales tax. It's not exactly what it was, but that's sort of what it was. And Paul is saying, give everyone what you owe him. And the first thing he's saying is pay your property tax, pay your poll tax, pay your head tax, pay your taxes, pay your merchandise tax. Then the question immediately arises, what about income tax? That is the bane of all of our existence right now. Well, the personal income tax as such not only was not in vogue in Paul's day, it really wasn't used ancient China had a type of personal income tax. So it wasn't a big deal back then, but today, as we all know, it is very, very controversial. And what makes it controversial are two elements: the extent of the income tax that's raised in Western cultures and the structure of the income tax. Now, we've been talking about governments being established by God. Remember their purpose. Their purpose is for our well-being. Their purpose is to what? Execute God's justice. Governments are to be righteous. They are to promote the good. They are to promote justice. And one of those concepts, one of those applications of justice is economic justice. Now, we see a lot of haranguing and a lot of complaining when it comes to taxes. One of the complaints from those that have worked hard for many, 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 many years to reach a certain economic status, a certain economic level, is that they are victims of injustice. because they have to pay a graduated percentage of their income. So in their view, not everyone in society then pays the same amount, because not everyone pays the same percentage. Now, what Paul is referring to specifically here is what was taking place in Rome, but the extension is very easy for our current context. Because in contrast, what he's talking about is a head tax. And the head tax was that every human being pays the same amount. Now, you've heard of a head tax. If you've been listening to the news at all, you've heard of it. And not only have you heard of it, you've actually heard of it in 3 different forms. The most noteworthy is the one that's getting beat left and right by the media, that has been offered by Dr. Ben Carson, the 10% flat tax. For all intents and purposes, what he's talking about is a head tax. And the rationale behind this was that every individual in society has an equal responsibility to pay taxes to support the public service of the government, because the government is there to protect, to be involved in their well-being. So they're giving to the government in that sense in order for the government to give back to them somehow in some sort of social context. Their giving is to promote within society the promotion of safety and the well-being of the public good. So, if everyone then is required to pay the same amount of taxes, everyone is treated equally and fairly, and that keeps governments, and this is where we see the rub in today's culture, that keeps governments from growing so large as to become oppressive to its citizenry. Now, the word, I'm not going to get into too much detail on it, but we use the word fairly. If you listen to the way the word fair is used today, it really is abused. I would dare say that, just from looking at all of us here, when we were growing up, we understood the definition of fair and what is fair in a much different way than the way they're using it today. When I was taught as a child what was fair, I was told that you treat everybody fairly, which means you treat everyone regardless of, well, this actually came later because I was raised in a racist home, but you treat everyone regardless of race, religion, culture, background, economic status. You treat everyone the same. You don't identify, you don't isolate certain people and then treat them differently for whatever reason, because they're black, because they're Chinese, because they're wealthy, because they're poor. You don't treat them any differently than you would want to be treated. That was how we understood the definition of fairness. And if you listen to politicians today, you don't hear that definition of fairness. That is not how fairness is described. Fairness is described based exactly upon the opposite of what I just said. It is actually based upon their status. You see, the fair tax, the flat tax, whatever you want to call it, a head tax, said, if you make, let's use Ben Carson as an example, because he's the whipping boy today. If you get paid $10,000 a year, let's just use that as a round number. If you get paid $10,000 a year, and the head tax or the flat tax says everybody pays 10%, you as an individual pay $1,000. 10% of $10,000, you pay $1,000. If you make $1,000, 10% of $1,000 is $100. So you're both being treated equally. But notice, the person that makes more money pays what? More in taxes. But that payment is not punitive. It's not retributive. It's fair. You pay 10%, I pay 10%. It's fair. That, however, is not the way the tax system works today. Today they use it as a tool to divide and conquer. You see, if the government decides to raise taxes, and they do it based on a flat tax, then such an increase in taxation is equal for everyone, and therefore they don't have to worry about the entire civilization, the entire population of a country rising up in revolt, such as a tea tax, causing a revolution, because everybody's getting treated fairly. But if you remove a flat tax or a head tax, and it becomes a graduated or a progressive tax, and that word actually gives me spastic colitis every time I hear somebody use that word progressive, because there's nothing progressive about what they're talking about. But if you substitute a head tax or flat tax for a graduated or progressive tax, then the government knows that they can pit one class of society over against another. And by doing that, what does it do? If I am the government and I institute upon each of you a 10% head tax, or a flat tax, let's use the word flat tax for today, and I raise your taxes, I'm raising taxes on all of you, am I not? So you all pay the same thing. So if I raise it to an exorbitant amount on all of you, and you're all being treated the same way, what happens? You get ticked off, you revolt, and you come after me, the American Revolution. Right? But what happens if I say, okay, everyone from Norma from Kathy to my left is going to pay, well, I don't know, let's say 8%. But everybody from Phil to the right is going to pay 25%. What happens? You don't complain about me, you go after each other. Well, why should they be paying less than I'm paying? Well, they should be paying more because they've got more. So the government, by raising taxes in a progressive or a graduated way, by implementing, and I'm going to use the term a socialist or a communist model because that's where it derives, redirects the hostility. Instead of having it directed at me as a government, it's now against one another. The interesting thing is if we go back and we look at the Old Testament, the concept of the tithe in the Old Testament required wealthy people to pay more. Because we just said, if it's a flat head tax, the wealthier you are, the more you're going to pay. It's an application of the concept of governmental justice. It's an application of God's understanding of what is just and fair. So in the Old Testament, when the tithe was paid, there was an equality of taxation percentage-wise, and that's the key. The percent of taxation was fair because it was the same for everybody. There was not an inequality of volume. In other words, the more you make, the more I'm going to take from you. But here's a question for you. And this bears on every single individual that lives within a government and pays taxes. What happens if said government supports causes, policies, or enacts laws with which we as Christians disagree? What do you do? That is not a theoretical question. You see, the concept of personal income tax, which had been kind of floated around for a long time, but didn't actually become an issue until our American Revolution, and then it kind of faded away. It came back during the Civil War when personal income tax was required to, and note this, raise money to raise troops for war. It then went away, and then it came back for a short period of time and wasn't finally made permanent until the 16th Amendment in 1913. that concept of personal income tax became a major issue over a number of government policies, most notably in the United States in the 60s. Anybody remember what was going on in the 60s? Why taxation was such a problem in the 60s? Because of Vietnam. People felt that government funds were being inappropriately spent on the use of military force. And I use the word inappropriate because it is a vague term, and it's intentionally vague. Because it may be inappropriate, my concept of using government funds inappropriately may be, well, we shouldn't use our money to go into the Middle East and depose a dictator who decides he's not going to adhere to UN resolutions. Or some may say on the other side that it is inappropriate to use government money to impose military force by sending 5 or 6 airstrikes a day to bomb certain people in a certain place. So inappropriate can be a very vague term. But that's not the only issue, the use of money for the military. We have today noticed, and have been dealing with it for many decades, what about the issue of abortion? Planned Parenthood debacle is only the tip of the iceberg. With tax dollars being spent on abortions, are we as Christians supposed to continue paying our taxes because it goes to abortions? Or how about something closer to home for all of us? What happens if you find out that your church is taking their tithes, and then from that they pay taxes, to support, the promotion of same-sex marriage, or LGBT issues, or how about aborted stem cell fetal research, or even sending money to the World Council of Churches? What are you supposed to do then with your tithe? That's a complex issue. I want to read a couple of quotes very briefly from the Didache. Now, the Didache was one of the earliest, if not the earliest, document that we have from the church. It extends well back into the 1st century. Some have actually dated this somewhere around like 40 or 45 AD. So this is really close to what the apostles were teaching. Now, it's not infallible, and it's not absolutely authoritative, but we do pay close attention to what the Didache says. As a matter of fact, one of the sections in the Didache, when it's speaking about the teaching of the 12 apostles and the 2 ways to live, says, "And this is the second commandment of the teaching. You shall not kill, you shall not commit murder, you shall not corrupt children, nor practice sexual deviation, you shall not steal, nor practice spiritism, nor use sorcery. You shall not procure an abortion." This is under the "thou shalt not kill." You shall not procure an abortion. Abortion is considered murder. This is the 1st century church. Now, what do we do today as Christians? Or how about our tithe in general? Listen to this. It has been said concerning this, "Let your money sweat in your hands until you know to whom you give it." Now think about that. What image does that conjure in your mind? I mean, they dealt with drachmas, they dealt with talents. We used to say some people can squeeze. George Halas was a great coach for the Chicago Bears. We used to say he was so cheap, he could squeeze a quarter and make the eagle cry. Now, think about that in reference to what the Didache just said. You hold your money in your hands until it sweats. What is it? What is he saying? You have a responsibility to think about to whom you're giving your money. Where does this money go? For what purpose is this being used? Is it being used by the institution to whom you are giving, whether it's the church or the government? Is it being used for a righteous, godly purpose? Is it being used to promote justice. These are not abstract, theoretical issues. This bears on all of us today, right now. That's a challenging question for you. And only you can answer that. I can't answer that question for you. I know my attitude, I know what I would say. And the other thing that jumps out in this passage, and it's a tremendous controversy today, and I don't know why. But the other thing that jumps out of this passage is that notice that within God's concept of government, there is payment to the Levites, payment to the church, or payment to the civil magistrates. They're not two governments. They're not two kingdoms. This is God's kingdom. He exercises his rule in two different ways, but it is his rule that he is exercising. It is his law that is being implemented and should be followed. So when we understand the concept of government, that it is to be used justly for the well-being of its citizenry, that it is supposed to represent God's character and present God's justice. The last verse tells us verse 7 says, render therefore, because of all of this, because this is how we are to view government, render to everyone what is due to them. Tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom, fear, fear, and honor, honor. And the interesting thing is the word custom here comes from, the word obligation or debt or pay to carries with it the concept of owing. It's duty. It's debt. Some translations call it give everyone what you owe them. Now we use the word owe both economically, but also there's a moral concept. And as we're talking about justice, this is what we want to talk about as we close. What then is the concept of justice in debt? Justice, by definition, means giving a person what's proportionate. The punishment fits the crime, so to speak. Well, if I promise to pay you X number of dollars for any object, and you give me that object, you then are due X number of dollars, not Y or Z. Justice demands that I fulfill my obligation. I owe you that. And that's what Paul is talking about here in his discussion of what the legitimate use of government is. It is our responsibility to pay taxes in principle because governments are to do good in principle. When tax is just, when it conforms to God's law or represents God's character in fairness and equality, my moral obligation, your moral obligation is to pay the tax. If that tax is not just, and here's the kicker, we're not obligated to pay it biblically. But then that's a serious challenge for everyone because the consequences can be dire. So give everyone what is due them. And I want you to look at the last phrase. I'm not going to talk about all of them. I'm only going to talk about the last 4 words. Give everyone what you owe him. This is R.C.'s translation. Give everyone what you owe him. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. Revenue, revenue. Respect, respect. If honor, then honor. If honor, then honor. That should scream to you the Decalogue. The 5th commandment, honor thy father and thy mother. Why? Why do you honor your father and your mother? That thy days be long in the land which the Lord thy God giveth. We honor our father and our mother. We honor them because it is God's justice that is meted out to us. It is his righteous character that is meted out to us. Honor them so that your days may be long in the land. In other words, honor them so that you may have eternal life. Think about that in today's culture. Think about how we interact with people. This was one of the complaints that Jesus had with the Pharisees. Remember, they would say, they would violate the Ten Commandments by paying the tithe, and then they would say, well, I don't have to take care of my elderly parents with money out of my pocket because I pay a tithe. And the church, the temple, takes care of them, which is what the temple did. It helped the poor. But Jesus is saying, no. That's your responsibility to take care of. You're supposed to adhere to the fifth commandment. Paul's saying the same thing. Honor those to whom honor is due. We are to honor our parents. We are to honor those in authority over us. We are to honor the elderly. We are to give them respect. We are to maintain people's dignity by showing honor to whom honor is due. And we can't just assume that our obligation is fulfilled if we pay taxes that take care of only material things. Because that's not God's primary concern. His primary concern is the heart. And remember what he said in the Old Testament. I want mercy. I want you to present. I want you to be merciful. I don't want sacrifice. I want you to exemplify my character. I want you to be just in the world.